Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Parallax podcast with our today's guest, Dr. Dhanasree Jayaram. Dr. Jayaram, let me begin by welcoming you to the podcast series and, more importantly, congratulating you on the publication of your book, Climate Diplomacy and Emerging Economies India as a Case Study. Um, for our viewers, Dr. Jayaram is currently an assistant professor in the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations and coordinator at the Center for Climate Studies, Manipal Academy of Higher Education, Karnataka, India. She's also a research fellow, Earth Systems Governance, ESG, and previously she has also authored a book titled Breaking Out of the Greenhouse, India's Leadership in the Times of Environmental Change, which was published in 2012. Um, so our today's conversation revolves around Dr. Jayaram's current book, which was published in February, right? As mentioned earlier, Climate Diplomacy and Emerging Economies. And it's a very interesting and important topic, uh, climate diplomacy, specifically because the topic of climate change is relatively a fresh field for Indian security and foreign policy think tanks specifically. Uh, while we all know that a lot of work has been done on climate change and environment overall, but to study and analyze it using the lens of traditional security and foreign policy is relatively new. And in that context, Dr. Jairam's book makes a very important intervention to study study the developments, to understand the present, and also somewhere understand the next steps. So in that context is where this conversation will revolve around. So Dr. Jairam, let me just start with a very straightforward question, which is why, according to you, is it important to study climate security from a Southern Asian perspective?
Thank you so much, first of all, for having me on this podcast. And this is my first podcast, so I'm very excited about it. To answer your question about understanding security implications of climate change from a Southern Asian perspective, it's very important because, as you yourself mentioned, there has not been much study on this, especially from a security perspective. There's not much data, there's not much evidence to show the linkages between climate change and security in Southern Asia. But if you look at things, you look at developments and recent trends, you can clearly see the connection. And I don't think anybody can refute that. Whether it is hardcore traditional security because of the effects of climate change on, say, something like military planning and strategy, as with the kind of changes happening, say, in the Hindu Kush Himalaya region or in the Indian Ocean region. And we all know what kind of pressures these kind of changes are putting even on an actor like the military. Secondly, it also affects human security. So we are forgetting the fact that security doesn't mean just traditional security or the hardcore national security. It also means human security, and therefore the impacts of climate change on various sectors like health or agriculture, all these different sectors, when they get affected, and we have seen how coastal populations, for instance, have been affected by climate change and how their livelihoods have been taken away by various extreme weather events and so on and so forth. So with these kind of changes, human security is equally affected as well. So in that sense, when we look at the interlinkages, they're quite clear because migratory patterns are being affected increasingly by climate change. Livelihoods are being affected by climate change. So there are so many different factors which are directly or indirectly affected by climate change. And of course, we also have the aspect of river water sharing. And this is something that has always been an albatross around the neck with all the countries in South Asia. We haven't resolved a lot of issues yet. We have divided the waters, but we haven't really thought of anything beyond that as to what are the ways in which we can cooperate and tackle the issue of climate change. So with some countries, it is much better. With other countries like Pakistan, obviously, India's relationship on
Mm.
Indus water sharing is much more complicated. So with all these issues, of course, climate change is going to be that additional burden, and which is why it needs to be considered a security issue, uh, uh, not just in the long term, but also in the short and medium terms.
Perfect. Um, so since India is the case study in the book, what has been India's position in climate diplomacy in terms of how has it evolved in the period which you specifically study, which is 2009 to 2019? So how has it evolved in this period, and what are some distinct markers to understand that evolution in the last 10 years, in that period of 10 years?
Yeah, so why I chose this period, maybe that will also give you an idea, because
Yeah.
2009 was a landmark year with the Copenhagen summit happening. And you saw that there was a clear geopolitical and geo-economic shift in
Hmm.
global politics with the emerging economies, the major emerging economies like Brazil, South Africa, India, and China. India and China more than the other two, of course, uh, started to play a much bigger role in the global scene. And with that, of course, there were more expectations from these countries to also commit to climate change mitigation efforts. And the shift actually started a little before 2009, from 2007 onwards. But 2009 was that watershed moment when you saw these four countries coming together, irrespective of various differences they have had between them over various issues. They still came together to basically thwart the attempts by the developed world to put more commitments or impose more commitments on the developing world. So that way, 2009 was a landmark year wherein all the four countries actually came up with their own voluntary targets. And just before 2009 summit, India in particular and China, all these countries also came up with their own national level plans and institutionalization of climate change policies within their own countries. And that is also very important to understand India's own climate diplomacy efforts, because what we have seen from 2009 onwards is, although technically you may not say it's a major shift internationally, but domestically, you could see a lot of efforts being put in place to make sure that climate change is mainstreamed into the policy making more and more. So 2009 to 2019, there have been a few shifts, of course, but overall, if you see, the idea was to put India at the forefront of climate diplomacy, to say that India is not a problem. India is a part of the solution. India should be treated as one. It's not a country that is an obstructor of climate policy. It should be seen as a country which is at the forefront of climate action. So all the governments, whether it was the Manmohan Singh government, as I have mentioned in my book, or of course the Narendra Modi government, has taken one step more in terms of putting India ahead in terms of climate action. But if you see right from 2009 onwards to the next government as well, we have seen more and more climate action efforts. And that too, it's like I have mentioned in my book, it's more to do with putting India as this responsible power, which needs to take up more commitments and responsibilities at the international level, especially on issues of global governance. And an issue like climate change, of course, presents that opportunity to portray India as a responsible power. So that was the kind of shift that happened. And as we moved ahead, of course, our domestic institutions were strengthened. Our positions became much more clearer. Our negotiating strategies were also much clearer. So with these kind of shifts, India's positions, like before, it was not the case, because there were a lot of attempts to put the ethical positions ahead of diplomatic positions. And these issues, of course, took a different shape during this period of 2009 to 19.
Um, So, Dr. Jairam, you mentioned about the emerging economies, and then you in the book you delved into into this grouping of basic countries, right? Um, which is an interesting study in itself, because we in the foreign policy circuit and in the security circle, we know of BRICS, we know of IPSA, but basic was a very important grouping, which is something which hasn't been around in our studies. Um, so what according to you, I mean, they were emerging economies, but what according to you made them stand out? And then there was also a period from where they also started going into in their respective ways on the or in the summits. So how did that evolve?
Yeah, so the evolution of basic is very interesting to see, and India, in fact, played a critical, pivotal role in basically bringing these countries together. And like I mentioned, the Copenhagen summit saw their emergence as a major negotiating grouping. So we normally, like you said, talk about BRICS, we talk about other groupings, but BASIC is more important to the climate negotiation
Hmm.
space. It may not be very important to other spaces like economy or trade or other kinds of sectors. So in that way, BASIC is very important to know because, like I mentioned, this is the grouping which put forth a certain position and said that we are ready to commit voluntarily, but you cannot impose targets on us. You cannot impose a legally binding agreement on us. You cannot ask us to dilute issues of equity and justice, especially not diluting differentiation between developed and developing countries. So even though countries had differences among themselves as far as operationalization of equity is concerned, for instance, because for India, per capita emissions is a huge part of our negotiating position because our per capita emissions are very low after all. Compared to other countries, including among the basic countries, ours is the lowest.
Hmm.
Whereas other countries are more concerned about historical responsibility and also about the carbon space, all of that. So India always put forth this concept of per capita emissions also. So right from the beginning, even though geopolitically there was a lot of reasons
Hmm.
for these countries to come together, but if you look at the differences that emerged, so for instance, in the book I have mentioned about South Africa. For this country, regional identity was equally important as much as trying to ally with the other major emerging economies. So therefore, South Africa was equally expected to stand with the African continent and with other least developed countries and developing countries of Africa. So it was under pressure to sort of move a little bit away from the basic position because basic position was seen as very negative, as a position that would be against the notion of global climate governance and any positive or constructive outcomes that could come out of it. So South Africa had to sort of move a little bit away from that position. Brazil wanted its own, that global position of a responsible power. China, of course, had its own ideas of climate governance. And as we have seen over the years, with China's emissions growing at a rapid pace, its per capita emissions growing at a rapid pace, almost at par with European Union, and also with China's aim to basically be part of this larger market where it can sell its renewable technologies to developing countries. With all these reasons, what we saw that different countries within the basic had different interests, and India was sort of left out. So right from actually Durban summit, you could see that things were not really working out between these countries. And some countries very openly, like Brazil, for instance, very openly said, I don't think BASIC is really working out. So over the period of time, BASIC started to fizzle out. But if you see annual summits are happening, there are, of course, a lot of conversations that are still ongoing. Equity, justice, transfer of finance and technology, these kind of issues are still being brought up. Measuring, reporting, and verification is another issue on which these countries have had similar positions as well. But as I mentioned, especially with some countries really growing much faster, like China, uh, and some countries, of course, going with their regional identity, all these things sort of played into how the differences between the basic countries also came up in the subsequent years, even though at Copenhagen Summit, they negotiated as this one solid grouping. So that solidarity among the countries did kind of get diluted over a period of time. And what we could also see was India was negotiating kind of solo in a lot of negotiations, which is why we saw also the emergence of the like-minded developing
Mm.
countries. So if BASIC was working really well, we could have probably brought in other players, but LMDCs doesn't have Brazil and South Africa. So you could clearly see some of these differences playing out in the subsequent years after the Copenhagen Summit.
Uh, Dr. Jairam, you mentioned China, and China becomes, I mean, in any conversation in foreign policy, security, and now in climate change as well, China has become an important player. Now, specifically when we talk about India and China, we always speak of them as either competitors or rivals, right? Cooperation is a new term. I mean, it's a relatively new term when you speak about India and China. And climate is a subject where India and China have cooperated, as you mentioned. So since they have cooperated within the basic frame, but how has their cooperation? They have cooperated outside the basic frame as well after the Durban summit. So, how has the cooperation between India and China been, and where does it stand today? Has China gone? Have they separated their ways? How does it look like today?
Yeah, like you mentioned, it's a very interesting uh, relationship to study as far as climate change is concerned, because the perception is that India, China are on the same side of the debate as far as climate change or climate policy is concerned. And but from my research, of course, BASIC has been a forum through which they have cooperated, and increasingly, like you said, even bilaterally, there has been a lot of cooperation going on. And after all, if you look at solar panels in India, most of them are manufactured in China, which may be good or bad, because that's a lot of dependence on Chinese manufacturing industry, which now India is trying to subvert as much as possible. So yes, there has been cooperation between India and China, but honestly, the romanticization of that kind of cooperation should also be avoided. Why I say that? Because both countries cooperated through forums like BASIC is only because they wanted to serve their own interests. It was not because they felt that these mutual interests are something they could carry forward for a long period of time. It was more like a short-term kind of gains they wanted from this kind of arrangement, when they knew that if four countries with similar kind of economy, similar state of, say, development or human development index, or for that matter, even a similar kind of per capita income range, and all these different factors, if you look at it, they felt that if these four countries come together, it's good for them to put more pressure on the developed countries. But beyond that, if you see where China has gone since then, China has taken its own path. So it's more like biding time, and then just as they do with most other
Yeah.
issues, they just took their time because they knew that they needed some more time to get on this path, and they knew the pressure was more on China rather than on India to act because of the reasons that I mentioned previously with the per capita emissions and all of that, and plus the fact that the economy was growing at such a fast pace, right? So because of these reasons, um, China took its own path over a period of time, and we could see that India did not want to be hyphenated with China, still doesn't want to be hyphenated with China, because it's at a very different level. So
Mm.
even if China acts, doesn't mean that India also has to act at the same level. With this kind of debate going on now, with China, for instance, declaring the carbon neutrality pledge to become carbon neutral by 2060, does that mean India also have to adopt such a target? So that's the whole point. So there are a lot of these parallels that are drawn between India and China, which India is always wary of because of the various factors I mentioned. So what I would say is that cooperation between China and India on climate change issues is also not as much as we think it was. So on negotiations, maybe they came together and on a few occasions to just avoid that kind of international pressure that was coming from the developed world in particular. But beyond that, if you looked at it, the cooperation between the two countries wasn't that much. So, I mean, it's kind of very sketchy kind of cooperation that has happened. Yeah.
So again, since we are still on China, now in the global order, and specifically while as we are discussing the subject of climate change and climate security, with during President Trump's time, the him pulling out of the Paris Agreement gave China a stronger position, right? And and now with the re-election, sorry, not re-election, beg your pardon, with election of Biden administration, the administration has put environment and climate change at forefront, which is visible with his upcoming 22nd, 23rd virtual summit on 22nd and 23rd of April. So how do you see the global world order plays right now in this context, with America again trying to acquire its position, previous position, maybe, if that's the correct way to say it?
One of the issues that comes up with the US is that when was US ever a climate leader? It was never so. So it never really ratified the Kyoto Protocol. It signed the Paris Agreement, but pulled out of it immediately after that because of various domestic reasons. So even if they have had progressive leaders at the presidential level who want to do something about climate change, they've had a lot of problems convincing
The
the Senate and
Congress.
the Congress about these actions. So that was always a problem in the U.S. And honestly, when Trump decided to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, of course, that left a vacuum because the idea was that the US is going to play a leading role
Mm.
in global climate governance. But with that withdrawal, of course, you had a lot of these players, including the European Union, China, India to a much lesser extent, but then definitely EU and China were at the forefront of trying to decide, okay, what can be the way forward from here. So there was, in fact, a lot of cooperation happening between EU and China in particular on climate change. Not as much between EU and India. Of course, EU and India started cooperating, but to a much lesser degree as compared to the kind of cooperation that started happening between EU and China. China, with its Belt and Road Initiative, also started. I mean, of course, initially there was a lot of criticism about BRI because BRI essentially is about investing in fossil fuel projects outside of China. So inside China, of course, they are maybe putting in a lot of policies to reduce their fossil fuel consumption, reducing emissions, a lot of changes in sectors like transport and energy. But if you look at their investments abroad, there is a lot of investment that is going into coal. So with this kind of change in the global climate order as well, China started to talk about green BRI, right? So trying to make investments in renewable energy projects more than fossil fuel projects, and which is something they're trying to sell a lot on various international platforms now. India, of course, also stepped ahead. So India had already had that platform of International Solar Alliance. More or less, India said that this is like an alternative to BRI, and this is a cleaner, more accessible, more just platform alternative to the BRI itself. So all these countries started putting forth their own ideas of how to fill that gap. Now, what you see with Biden coming to power is very interesting because now you have a climate envoy in the form of John Kerry.
Mm.
And he's a very dynamic leader who has been responsible for various agreements in the environmental arena signed by the US when Obama was in power. So he definitely wants to leave a legacy as far as climate change is concerned. And so he's going to pull all strings possible to make sure that China and India come on board. So which is why even recently he made this announcement, he made the statement, in fact, that even if in other areas we have this rivalry with China and the situation may not be very good for cooperation on climate change, we have to come together. So US is definitely going to reach out to China as much as possible on climate change. US is also going to reach out to India as much as it reaches out to China. So Kerry, with his visit to Delhi to decide what will be the outcomes of this virtual summit, which will include, of course, the major economies. Also, it will include developed countries and the most vulnerable countries as far as climate change is concerned. So the agenda is very clear here. And Kerry is definitely going to make sure that something more concrete comes from India, whether it is in the form of a carbon neutrality pledge, which I think won't be a surprise if India does go ahead and declare one before the Glasgow summit later this year, or something more. So definitely with Biden coming to power, domestically there are a lot of changes happening already in the US. Slow, gradual because of the domestic reasons, but then definitely a lot of things are happening. Internationally too, what I can see is that climate change is now a huge part of the US foreign policy agenda. So wherever Biden goes or wherever the Biden administration really go to, climate change is going to be a part of that agenda. So whichever country that may be. So that is a change that will definitely bring climate change to the forefront of foreign policy and global governance, of course.
So, as you mentioned the Glasgow summit, and that specifically brings me to my last question, which is again related to India. On how does India's climate diplomacy uh, look like at this stage when there are these deliberations going on around the net zero carbon emission targets, and especially with I think it's scheduled for November if things go around well. So where is India placed in a very simple manner? Where is India placed in all this at this stage?
So like I mentioned, India may go ahead and declare a net zero pledge, but to declare one is not going to be easy because it means that a lot of changes have to be brought into our domestic setup, whether it is institutionally, structurally, policy-wise. There have to be a lot of changes. And we also have to make sure that a lot of our states which are dependent on, say, coal production, also have to undergo drastic structural changes, and diversification approaches have to be adopted on that front too. So this means that it's not going to be easy for India to declare one, but it would make sense internationally to declare one. And this is also part of, like I mentioned in the first question that you asked, this is part of India's ongoing efforts to show India as a responsible power as well. So yes, this will send out a good message to the rest of the international community. And it's not just developed countries who want this. So it's also, for instance, India's neighboring countries who want India to be more committed to climate change. So a net zero pledge is obviously going to go down well with the international community, putting India once again in that spotlight. So yes, so that is definitely something that India may gain from. But domestically, like I mentioned, it's not going to be easy. Especially since we are still on that path of increasing our coal production and consumption. So we have to see, are we going to peak emissions, say, sometime in the 2030s, which again looks unlikely from the current scenarios. And if we have to reach net zero, say, by 2050, it means that we have to peak very soon. And without peaking, you cannot reach net zero. And we have no idea of these scenarios, right? So there have been a lot of studies which have come up in the past few weeks on these issues. But definitely, like I mentioned, internationally, this would make complete sense. And India may, in fact, especially with Kerry's visit as well, this may come up more fervently, and maybe this is going to be that moment when India would go ahead and declare one. Um, but this is just my personal opinion. If you look at India's climate diplomacy, it has of course evolved a lot, and like I mentioned, it has evolved in such a way that we are moving in the right direction. That way, there is that progressive kind of action which has been happening. But I think we also need to think of other ways, and we need to think of ways in which it can be also it can be stepped up even further. And that way we need to focus on other issues also. So I think a lot of focus right now on decarbonization, which is why even recent debates wherein the prime minister and other ministers have spoken about climate change, a lot of focus is on how we have done a lot in solar energy, wind energy, a little bit of decarbonization efforts in transport sector and so on and so forth. But beyond that, our adaptation requirements have grown multifold. And I think the worsening impacts of climate change have kind of brought our attention to an issue which needs a lot more investments and a lot more finances and technological interventions or social interventions to make sure that our vulnerabilities don't grow further. So climate diplomacy also needs to cater to this rather than just about decarbonization efforts, because that is just one leg of climate action. So this is just my personal opinion that it needs to kind of step up, and also needs to include other factors and other pillars of climate action. But if you look at what's going to happen in Glasgow, yes, the net zero is going to be one of the major focus areas for all countries, and market mechanisms, which did not get finalized at the Madrid summit. And possibly this is going to be discussed as well, because the future of the clean development mechanism and the credits, the cheap credits that countries, including India, received during that time, I mean, during the Kyoto period, what will be the future of those credits? All these things will have to be also worked out, because market mechanisms are going to be a major part of how countries achieve their Paris targets as well. So these are some of the issues which will come up, and which are, of course, going to create a lot of momentum towards more and more climate action.
Perfect, Dr. Jayaram. I think this brings us to the end of this conversation. So thank you for joining us in this podcast, and thank you for a very comprehensive discussion. And to our viewers, thank you for watching this, and we'll soon be back with another podcast soon. So thank you once again.